In the city's quietest corners, greed glitters brighter than gold, and just as deadly. It began with a murder in a room lined with wealth, and ended beneath the calm of a single man's reason. Between them lay a trail of deception, love, and the kind of ambition that corrodes everything it touches. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. Fritz was polishing the gold trim along the dining room wainscoting like it was the crown jewels. He'd been at it since breakfast, humming a Viennese march and wiping at invisible specks with a cloth so reverent you'd think he was tending to the Holy Grail. I watched from the doorway, coffee cup in hand, and told him straight, "Fritz, one of these days you're going to polish that moulding so hard it files for citizenship." He sniffed without looking at me. "Cleanliness, Mr. Goodwin, is civilization." "Sure," I said, "but there's a difference between civilization and compulsive behavior." He waved me off with that European dignity that could make a horse feel underdressed. I left him to it and wandered toward the office, still wondering whether Wolfe had finally decided to turn the brownstone into a museum of gold plating and good intentions. When you live with Nero Wolfe, you learn to measure insanity in ounces of butter and degrees of polish. Fritz's culinary devotion and Wolfe's orchid worship could have filled entire textbooks on obsession. But that morning, the brownstone had a sheen of something extra, a kind of false glitter. Maybe it was the sunlight off the polished brass, or maybe it was the quiet before one of those phone calls that never brings anything but work. By the time I hit the office, Wolfe was already at his breakfast, 3 eggs, lightly scrambled, and a look of divine disappointment at the world. He didn't glance up when I entered. "Archie," he said, still studying his plate. "Discipline and aesthetics are the twin columns upon which civilization rests. Fritz understands this. You do not." I leaned on the desk. "If civilization depends on polished moulding and overcooked eggs, then we're all doomed." He sniffed. "The eggs are not overcooked. They are precisely as they should be." "Funny," I said. "They look about as lively as your waistline." That earned me a glare over his teacup. "Your levity is intolerable at this hour." "Then it's working," I said. He grunted and turned to the newspaper. The air smelled like strong coffee and stronger disapproval. Outside, Manhattan was humming, but inside, Wolfe's brownstone might as well have been a monastery, with one monk who worshipped orchids and loathed movement. I was about to suggest we both get some exercise when the phone rang, a sharp, unexpected sound that sliced through Wolfe's breakfast sermon like a slap. He frowned. "Answer it. If it's another salesman, I shall move to Bhutan." I picked up the receiver. The voice on the line wasn't selling anything. It was trembling, desperate, and female. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. Her tone had that fragile edge people get when they've been awake all night, regretting something. "That depends who's asking," I said. "This is Eleanor Vale. I've been accused of theft. They say I stole something from the Cornell Club. I didn't. Please, someone told me Mr. Wolfe helps people." Wolfe raised an eyebrow at me from across the room, already disapproving of the human race in general, and this caller in particular. "What did you supposedly steal?" I asked. "Gold," she whispered. "Antique ingots from a private collection. And there's been a death." Wolfe made a low sound, like a bull snorting, before deciding whether to charge. I covered the receiver. "Murder," I mouthed. He scowled. "Tell her we are not a confessional." I ignored him. "Where are you, Mrs. Vale?" "I'm on my way to your office," she said. "I didn't know where else to go. They'll arrest me, please." The line went dead. I hung up slowly. Wolfe muttered, "Inconvenient creatures, women in distress. They have no sense of timing." "Sure," I said, "but they do have money." He grunted, but his eyes flickered, interest masked as disdain. That's Wolfe's version of curiosity. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same trembling voice, same desperation. Only this time she mentioned numbers. "I can pay," she said breathlessly. $10,000 if Mr. Wolfe will help me. Please. I nearly dropped the receiver. 10 grand buys a lot of orchids, and even more beer. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. His no was halfway formed when she added, "There's a man dead. They think I killed him." That stopped him cold. He leaned back in his chair, puffing at his lower lip like he was tasting the air for logic. $10,000, I repeated, and a murder charge. He closed his eyes. Archie, there are moments when Providence tempts me. Tell her to come. I hung up and grinned. Thought so. I'll wager Fritz's next souffle that she'll be in that red chair before the hour's up. Pfui, he said, which is Wolfe for maybe. As I tidied up the desk, Fritz peeked in. A visitor. Trouble, I said, but the kind that tips well. Fritz shook his head. I shall prepare brandy. By the time the doorbell rang, Wolfe was sitting upright, eyes closed, as if preparing for surgery. You could feel it in the air, the heavy quiet that comes right before the storm. She came in like a ghost that had overdressed for the occasion. Mid-30s, expensive taste on the edge of collapse. Her gloves were still damp from nerves. I'm Mrs. Eleanor Vale, she said softly. Thank you for seeing me. Wolfe gestured toward the red leather chair, without rising. You are not thanked. Mr. Goodwin has an unfortunate sense of hospitality. I shot him a look. We're a full-service outfit, Mrs. Vale. Ignore the philosopher. She smiled faintly, then opened her bag. From it, she drew a folded newspaper. Front page, crime section. Cornell Club murder. Gold room looted. My husband died 3 years ago, she said. He was a restorer for the club's art collection. Yesterday they found one of his old associates dead. They think I took the gold he once worked with. I glanced at Wolfe. His expression didn't move, but his fingers tapped once on the armrest, a rare show of interest. The gold room, he asked. A hidden chamber, she said. They used it for private viewings. My husband called it the place where secrets shine. Her voice trembled. Now it's a crime scene, and I'm the villain. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, eyes half closed, as she continued. The club's president, Simon Ketteridge, is leading the accusations. He said I had motive, that I'd been desperate for money. At that name, Wolfe froze. His lips tightened, his gaze shifting to a point far away and unpleasant. I frowned. You know this Ketteridge? Wolfe's tone was ice. I know him. He is a man to whom truth is ornamental, used only for display. Eleanor looked between us, confused. He's powerful. He'll ruin me. Wolfe stood abruptly, a rare event worthy of a parade. That man again, he muttered, pacing toward the door. Mr. Goodwin, you will see that Mrs. Vale is comfortable, I must think. He disappeared toward the orchids, leaving the air thick with tension and unspoken history. Eleanor's eyes widened. Did I say something wrong? Not at all, I said. You just kicked over a very old anthill. She managed a weak smile. Then I suppose I should be grateful I'm not the only one haunted by Simon Ketteridge. I didn't answer. Wolfe's footsteps faded upstairs, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the trouble ahead wasn't just gilded. It was personal. Wolfe's voice drifted faintly from the hallway, low and sharp. That man again. And I couldn't tell whether he meant Ketteridge or himself. You'd think a man who weighed 1/7 of a ton would be hard to rattle, but the name Ketteridge did it. Wolfe's jaw set like wet cement. He folded his hands on his stomach and shut his eyes, a sure sign that Mount Nero was preparing for eruption. Archie, he said finally, Simon Ketteridge is a man I shall not tolerate under my roof, nor within my contemplation. He is a fraud dressed as a philanthropist and an imbecile in a scholar's cloak. Our last encounter sufficed for a lifetime. Eleanor Vale blinked at him from the red chair. But you must help me, Mr. Wolfe. He's the one accusing me. Madam, Wolfe interrupted, I will not revisit old enmities. $10,000 will not buy me irritation. She looked ready to faint, and Fritz, hovering like an anxious butler angel, passed her a glass of water. I leaned against the globe stand, watching Wolfe's forehead darken. "That's noble," I said. "But in case you've forgotten, orchids don't eat fresh air." He glared at me, but his fingers tapped once on the desk, always the first tremor of reconsideration. I figured he needed help seeing things in perspective, or more accurately, in dollars. "Look," I said, 10 grand could fund a full year of your imported beer, another for the orchids, and a new oven for Fritz so he'll stop threatening to elope with the butcher. That's a bargain." "Pah," Wolfe said, closing his eyes again. "Money is a vulgar incentive. Dignity cannot be bartered like pork futures." "Sure," I said, "but dignity doesn't pay the gas bill." Eleanor watched us, torn between hope and horror. I gave her a wink. "He talks like this before every case. It's his way of haggling with his conscience." "I do not haggle," Wolfe said sharply. "I deliberate. There is a distinction." "Fine," I said. "Deliberate faster. The lady's running low on nerves." He scowled, picked up the newspaper, and pretended to read. But the name Ketteridge hung in the room like a bad odour, one Wolfe couldn't quite filter out. The tension was thick enough to chew when Fritz appeared with a tray. He'd brought coffee, and because emotional warfare required sustenance, a dish of something that smelled faintly of heaven and mustard. "Veal," he announced, with a little wine and regret. Wolfe grunted. I helped myself, earning a glare from both of them. "Fritz," I said, "you'd better give him extra sauce. He's about to choke on his pride." Fritz folded his towel over one arm. "Gold makes fine sauces but poor companions," he said. "It brings only indigestion." I stared. "You've been taking philosophy lessons in the kitchen again." "From life," he replied solemnly, and vanished before Wolfe could insult him. Wolfe sighed. "I employ 2 men who would rather blather than think." "Sure," I said, "but one of us can cook." That got him. The corner of his mouth twitched, a fractional surrender, but he still refused to look at Eleanor. She sat rigid, her gloved hands clutched tight. Whatever storm had been brewing in her life was now squarely over ours. Mrs. Vale reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded newspaper, her hand trembling so badly she nearly tore it. "Please," she said, "look at this." I took it from her. Cornell Club Restorer slain. Woman seen in argument before death. The photo was grainy but clear enough. Eleanor Vale, in evening dress, mid-sentence, with anger written across her face. Wolfe scanned it, nostrils flaring. "The journalistic equivalent of a street brawl," he said, "crude and self-serving." "They'll believe it," she whispered. "Everyone will. Someone wanted this printed." Her voice cracked on the word wanted. Wolfe's head lifted slightly. "You are implying orchestration, a deliberate smear?" "Yes. Simon Ketteridge told them I quarrelled with Julian Marin over money. I didn't. He was my husband's friend." Her breath came in shaky bursts, and I set the clipping on Wolfe's desk. "Looks like somebody's running a press campaign to go with their frame job." He didn't answer. But his fingers tapped again. That was 2 taps. The third would mean surrender. "This," Wolfe said finally, "is inflammatory rubbish. It presumes more intelligence from the press than they deserve." "Maybe," I said, "but Kramer won't call it rubbish. He'll call it probable cause." That made him grunt. "Inspector Kramer," he said, like naming a fungus, "a man with the imagination of a doorknob." "Right," I said, "but a doorknob with a warrant. If he smells a body and a suspect, he'll knock, and keep knocking until the hinges give out. You sure you want him doing that here?" Mrs. Vale's face went pale. Wolfe regarded her over steepled fingers. "Madam, did you come here expecting protection or redemption?" "Both," she said quietly. "Pfui," he muttered. "Then you expect miracles." I leaned forward. "If you don't take this case, she'll be dragged off by dinner, and if she's guilty, we'd better find out before Kramer does." He eyed me, weighing logic against annoyance. Logic was winning. Wolfe exhaled heavily, as though expelling the entire human race from his lungs. "Very well," he said. "We shall proceed, but under conditions." Eleanor's eyes brightened. "You mean you'll—" "I mean," he said sharply, "that I shall conduct this investigation without leaving this house. Mr. Goodwin will handle the fieldwork. You will remain silent unless addressed. And the $10,000, cash, will be deposited immediately." She nodded, relief flooding her face. I grinned. "You see, Mrs. Vale, that's Wolfe's way of saying welcome aboard." "Pfui," he said. "Mr. Goodwin, cease your insolence and take her particulars. Then telephone Saul Panzer. If we are to wade into this morass, I prefer reliable boots." I opened my notebook. For the first time that morning, the brownstone felt alive again. Money, murder, and Wolfe's ego, always a productive combination. I had just started to enjoy the sense of motion when the doorbell rang, hard and twice. Wolfe scowled. "Confound it, Fritz!" But I was already moving. When I opened the door, Inspector Kramer was standing there with a warrant in one hand and a grin you could hang laundry on. Trouble had officially arrived, and it was wearing a badge. By the time I reached the Cornell Club, Midtown was its usual self. Too much traffic, too many doormen, and too many people pretending not to care what anything cost. The place itself looked like someone had taken old money, dipped it in polish, and hung a chandelier over it for emphasis. Inside, you wouldn't know a murder had taken place except for the faint odor of disinfectant and the hush that follows expensive shock. Men in tailored suits loitered in corners, murmuring in voices that could buy and sell half the city. No one wanted to admit that one of their own had been found with his skull cracked like an egg in the gold room. A uniform stopped me at the elevator. I gave him my card. Archie Goodwin, representing Nero Wolfe. His eyebrows twitched. "That fat guy. The world's leading sedentary genius," I said. "Where's your boss?" He jerked a thumb toward the top floor. "Upstairs. And watch your step. Inspector Kramer's in a mood." That figured. Kramer's moods were famous. I took the elevator up, adjusting my tie and my attitude. The scent of old cigars, stale money, and something faintly metallic greeted me when the doors opened. If death had a cologne, it was definitely from the Cornell Club collection. The gold room was everything its name promised and more. Gold leaf ceilings that glowed like the inside of a treasure chest, velvet drapes heavy enough to block out guilt, and enough ornate furniture to make Versailles look thrifty. At the far end of the room lay Julian Marin, art restorer and part-time parasite, sprawled beside a smashed glass cabinet. His face wore the blank look of a man who'd underestimated both gravity and someone's temper. A blunt ceremonial hammer lay near his hand, still stained dark at the head. I'd seen murder scenes before, but this one reeked of excess. Whoever killed Marin hadn't just taken his life. They'd taken $500,000 in gold ingots that had been locked in that cabinet. A photographer was finishing up, bulbs popping like nervous fireflies. I stepped closer to the wreckage, crouching to get a look at the glass shards. "Mind the crime scene," a voice barked. I turned. Kramer, built like a fire hydrant, face like one too, only redder. He shoved his hat back. "Goodwin, let me guess. Wolfe sent you because getting out of his chair would kill him." "Something like that," I said. "But don't worry, I brought his brain with me." Kramer's grin stretched. "That's so. Well, his brain better come with a mop. We've got a corpse, missing gold, and 20 men who think homicide's beneath their membership fees." "I can see that," I said, eyeing the carpet. "Red never was this year's colour." He snorted. "Cut the wisecracks. You tell Wolfe this case is closed before he gets any ideas. Marin was mixed up in some funny business, selling fake art, blackmailing the wrong people. Somebody got tired of paying." I walked past him toward the cabinet remains. "You sound sure." "I am. Everyone in the boardroom upstairs has an alibi. They were all at an art auction across town, including Ketteridge. Case closed." "Except Wolfe doesn't like closed doors," I said. "He prefers them cracked." Kramer grunted. Then tell him to crack this from his armchair. And by the way, his client's in trouble. Eleanor Vale's name came up this morning. Seems she and Maren had a little shouting match before he wound up dead. I kept my expression steady. That's so, he smirked. You didn't know. Maybe your boss should have left the orchids for once. I smiled back. If he did, Kramer, you'd be out of a job. Kramer puffed on a cigar that smelled like it had been rolled in arrogance. Every board member was at that auction, Goodwin. Paintings, wine, witnesses, the works. Alibis don't get better than that. Except when they do, I said. He raised an eyebrow. Meaning? Meaning alibis have this funny habit of being convenient, especially when they're airtight enough to suffocate. Kramer jabbed his cigar toward me. Don't start, Goodwin. You and Wolfe both think you can outsmart a clock. Facts are facts. Sure, I said. So who's missing from this social hour? He hesitated. One name. Diana Ketteridge, Simon's wife. She wasn't at the auction. Claimed she had a headache. Headache, I repeated. That the new alibi for murder? He scowled. Don't get cute. She's got nothing to do with it. The woman's striking, I offered. Sharp-tongued, prone to temper. His glare said I'd hit something. She's trouble, but not that kind. Funny, I said. That's what they always say before it turns out to be exactly that kind. I moved toward the door, leaving him to his cigar smoke and self-satisfaction. Outside, the hall gleamed like money freshly laundered. Somewhere beneath all that polish, something rotten was starting to show through. And Wolfe, sitting back in his brownstone fortress, was about to smell it all the way uptown. I straightened my tie and headed for the nearest phone booth. Wolfe would want a report, and this time, the gold wasn't the only thing shining suspiciously. Diana Ketteridge was the kind of woman you'd expect to see framed, preferably in oil, and preferably by a master who knew how to paint ice without losing the shine. She stood near the shattered cabinet, gloved hands resting on a small crocodile skin case that probably cost more than my yearly salary. Kramer was grilling her with his usual finesse, meaning none. You said you came in here after the alarm, Mrs. Ketteridge. What exactly did you touch? She lifted her chin. Nothing. I was horrified. That might have been true, but horror doesn't usually come with a whiff of expensive perfume and a steady pulse. I caught a faint glimmer on her glove case, gold dust, fine as powder, catching the light just so. Nice bag, I said, stepping closer. Imported? Her eyes flicked to me, cool and amused. Is that relevant, Mr. Goodwin, Nero Wolfe's assistant. I noticed details for a living. She gave me a smile like a slap. Then notice this. I have better things to do than indulge amateurs. The line was smooth, but there was a flicker behind her eyes. A sharp, involuntary tremor that didn't belong in her performance. Fear. I said nothing. Some women talk with words, others with what they try too hard to hide. And this one was saying plenty. Kramer's patience was wearing thin, which meant the temperature in the gold room dropped about 10 degrees. He turned toward Eleanor Vale, who had been standing off to one side, twisting her gloves like a guilty conscience. All right, Mrs. Vale, he barked. You claim you came here this morning to meet the manager. Why bring your handbag into a crime scene? She stammered. I didn't think. That much is clear, Kramer said. Let's see it. I stepped forward. Easy, Inspector. She's our client. He grinned without humor. Then you'd better hope she's clean. Eleanor hesitated, then handed over her small leather purse. Kramer opened it like a magician about to reveal a trick, only this one had no applause. He tilted the lining under the light, and there it was, a single, shining flake of gold clinging stubbornly to the fabric. The air went still. Even Diana Ketteridge's poise cracked for a heartbeat. Kramer looked at me with that grin of his, the one that says he's just won the first round. Tell Wolfe he can save his breath. Looks like your client's been glittering in the wrong room. Eleanor shook her head, tears trembling on her lashes. I swear, I don't know how. I wanted to believe her, but the evidence gleamed back like a curse. The gold was too bright, too perfect, too deliberate. And as I watched Kramer bag the purse, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had just tightened the noose, and Eleanor Vale was standing squarely inside it. If Nero Wolfe ever got tired of orchids and murder, he could have made a decent living as a hanging judge. That morning, he turned the office into his private courtroom, with me as the reluctant witness and the breakfast tray serving as the jury box. He sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled, glaring at me as though I'd buried the body myself. "You observed the scene," he said. "Describe the arrangement of the gold room again, slowly." I sighed. For the fourth time. Dead restorer on the floor, smashed cabinet, gold gone, cops gloating, Kramer grinning like he'd just been elected mayor of stupidity. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. And Mrs. Vale's reaction to the gold flake? She nearly fainted. If she's faking, she deserves an award. He snorted. Emotion, Mr. Goodwin, is a poor indicator of innocence. Hysteria and deceit share the same wardrobe. I leaned back. And you, being a master tailor, can tell the difference. He ignored that. There is a thread of order behind this tapestry of absurdity. I merely need the light angled correctly. That's Wolfe speak for I'm annoyed but intrigued. And when Wolfe's intrigued, the world had better keep its insurance paid up. Right on cue, Fritz glided in with a silver tray, the smell of veal ragout trailing behind him like a peace offering from the gods. Lunch, he said softly, as if the word itself might soothe tempers. I grabbed a fork. Wolfe gave me a look that could have melted butter. You have the manners of a hyena, Archie. This is a time for thought, not consumption. Some of us multitask, I said through a mouthful. Besides, I defend better on a full stomach. He wasn't listening. He was pacing, Wolfe pacing being roughly the equivalent of a normal man's brisk jog. A mosaic of deceit lacquered in gold, he muttered. A forgery, a murder, and a theft that was never meant to succeed. It offends logic. And me. Fritz set the plates down gently. Gold, he mused, makes fine sauces but poor companions. I grinned. See? Even Fritz agrees with me. You can't think straight on an empty plate. Wolfe groaned. Mr. Goodwin, you are proof that civilization survives purely by accident. But the ragout did its job. He sat down again. Appetite and intellect rekindled. I'd seen that look before, the storm clouds gathering behind those heavy eyelids. It meant his brain was starting to boil faster than Fritz's veal. By the time Saul Panzer arrived, Wolfe's patience had worn thinner than the gravy boat. Saul, calm as always, eased into the red chair and handed over a folded paper. Background on Julian Marin, he said. Turns out he had a side business, blackmail. Wolfe arched a brow. How droll. Explain. Through the club's private art fund, he'd authenticate fake pieces for certain members, then threaten to expose them. One of those members, Simon Ketteridge. That did it. Wolfe's nostrils flared like a bull's. Blackmail, forgery, gold, and Ketteridge. A symphony of vice in 3 movements. Saul nodded. And Ketteridge wasn't the only one. 2 other board members were paying quiet money to keep their names off the record. I whistled low. So Marin wasn't just an art restorer. He was running a racket with the finesse of a dentist extracting cash. Wolfe leaned back, hands clasped over his stomach. Mr. Ketteridge's influence extends further than I anticipated, and Mrs. Vale, poor woman, is the ideal scapegoat, a widow with proximity and no protection. Saul's voice stayed even. He's dangerous, Wolfe. He's not just playing at art. He's covering something bigger. Wolfe gave him a thin smile. Then let us ensure he plays his final movement in the proper key, minor and terminal. A few hours later, Fred Durkin called from a payphone, his voice rasping with street grit. Got something, boss. Ketteridge met with a guy from the Federal Treasury 2 nights ago. Quiet meeting. Back alley behind the Harvard Club. I relayed it, and Wolfe's eyes snapped open like shutters. The Treasury? Fascinating. Art forgery alone would not attract their attention. Gold transactions might. Fred continued. Looked like an exchange. Papers, envelopes, handshake. Then the Treasury man left with a briefcase. Did you get a name? I asked. Couldn't hear, but the man's badge flashed when he turned. Treasury enforcement. I glanced at Wolfe. So Ketteridge's got Uncle Sam on his guest list. Indeed, Wolfe said grimly. A man of culture and corruption. The combination is lethal. The gold was not stolen. It was being laundered. He turned to me. Mr. Goodwin, summon Mrs. Vale. It is time she stopped omitting the useful parts of her late husband's biography. I couldn't argue. When Wolfe switched from sarcasm to precision, someone was about to be dissected, verbally. And if I had to guess, Mrs. Vale's secrets were about to lose their gilt edge. Eleanor Vale arrived pale and tight-lipped, clutching her handbag as if it were armor. Wolfe motioned her to sit, which she did with the hesitation of a student about to fail an exam. Madam, he began, voice soft but razor-sharp. What precisely did your husband conceal in the gold room? Her eyes widened. I don't understand. Do not insult my intelligence, Wolfe snapped. You admitted he once stored something there. Was it money, documents, contraband? She faltered. It wasn't money. He told me it was precious and dangerous. Something that could ruin men if it were found. Ah, Wolfe said, leaning back. Gold then, but not merely metal, likely certificates. Counterfeit bullion bonds, perhaps, laundered through the Cornell Club's art fund. Her breath caught. You think he was part of it? No, Wolfe said. He was the vault, and now they've made you the vault's ghost. That one landed. Her composure cracked. A tear slipped down. I handed her a tissue and said quietly, They're not just framing you, Mrs. Vale. They're erasing your husband. She looked at Wolfe. Can you stop them? I can, he said, provided no more omissions emerge from your repertoire. It was near midnight when the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting Kramer. Instead, Saul's voice came through, tight and uneven. A rarity for him. Archie, someone just tried to run me down outside the Cornell Club. Black sedan, no plates. My grip tightened. You hurt? Bruised pride, that's all. But they mean business. I turned to Wolfe, who was already watching me, his eyes narrowed. I repeated the details. He didn't move for a full 5 seconds. Then softly. So the gold trail leads to desperation. Fritz peeked in, worried. Is someone hurt? Almost, I said. Saul's got 9 lives, but someone's trying to shorten the set. Wolfe stood. An event worthy of headlines. Mr. Goodwin, instruct Mr. Panzer to remain unseen for 48 hours. The assailant is rattled, which means the endgame approaches. Eleanor, still seated, whispered, You think they'll kill again? Wolfe looked at her, then at me. Murder, madam, is the natural solvent of cowardice, and our enemy is dissolving fast. He sank back into his chair, eyes closing in thought. So, he murmured, someone gilds their lies with murder. I'd heard that tone before. The one that meant Nero Wolfe had begun to see the pattern, and when Wolfe saw a pattern, someone's luck was about to end. And fast. I reached for the phone again, ready to alert Saul and Fred, but Wolfe stopped me with a single word. Wait! His eyes opened, gleaming. The next move, Archie, is not theirs, but ours. The morning papers were thick with bad news and bad writing, as usual. But the Gazette managed to outdo itself with one headline that made my stomach tighten. Socialite found dead in parked car. Gold dust in her hair. I read on, and the picture sharpened into something ugly. Diana Ketteridge, Simon's wife, the same high-gloss brunette who'd sneered her way through my questions in the gold room, had been found dead in her coupe on Riverside Drive. The article called it, An apparent suicide. I call that lazy reporting. The details were too neat for comfort. A half-finished note on the passenger seat. Forgive me, I can't bear the shame. A small pistol clutched in her right hand, though she'd been strangled before the bullet ever fired. The gold dust in her hair was a touch of theatricality that would have made Broadway jealous. Fritz came in with coffee and frowned at my expression. Bad news, Mr. Goodwin. Worse, I said, folding the paper. It's good news for someone else. Because if there's one thing I've learned working for Wolfe, it's that when a woman like Diana Ketteridge turns up dead, somebody nearby just started sleeping a lot better. By 9 o'clock, the brownstone phone rang like Judgment Day. Inspector Kramer's voice growled down the line, thick with satisfaction. Tell your boss the case is wrapped, he said. Diana Ketteridge offed herself. Guilt, greed, the usual cocktail. Veil's clear, and I'm taking the credit. You sure? I asked. Or are you just afraid Wolfe might disagree? He snorted. Don't make me laugh. The suicide note's signed, the gun's clean, and the husband's in shock. There's your story. I smiled into the receiver. You forgot one thing. When things look perfect, they usually stink. Listen, Goodwin, not every corpse is a conspiracy. Sometimes people just die. Sure, I said, and sometimes gold just walks away from vaults on its own. He slammed the phone down, which meant I'd scored a hit. I took my victory lap to the kitchen, where Fritz was slicing pears. He sounds happy, Fritz said. Yeah, I told him, like a man dancing on quicksand. Because if Kramer was patting himself on the back this early, I'd have bet Wolfe's entire beer cellar that he was dead wrong, and probably standing in the middle of someone else's setup. When I relayed the news, Wolfe was halfway through a breakfast that could have fed a regiment. He didn't even blink. Bah, he said finally. A suicide note is too obvious. And you said her hair contained gold dust. Right. Maybe she used the wrong powder puff. Pfui. A woman of Mrs. Ketteridge's vanity would not stage her own death in so vulgar a manner. She was strangled before that note was written. I raised an eyebrow. You haven't seen her, Doc. I do not require the sight of a corpse to read its story. The human neck, Mr. Goodwin, is an eloquent witness. Ligature marks precede deceit, not follow it. He pushed his plate aside and leaned back. This was a performance. Someone needed her death to close an account, financial, emotional, or otherwise. The note was the curtain call. Meaning what? Meaning, he said, reaching for his cigar, that Inspector Kramer's triumph will soon rot in his hands. Prepare to answer the telephone. When the autopsy confirms strangulation, he will call, furious and confused. 2 admirable states for a policeman. I grinned. And what state will we be in? Alert, Wolfe said, lighting his cigar. And hungry. Murder, Mr. Goodwin, is best pursued on a full stomach. I poured myself coffee and thought about the gold dust in Diana's hair. Wolfe might not have seen her body, but I had a feeling he was already dissecting the next one. By the time I revisited the Cornell Club, the atmosphere had all the warmth of a bank vault. The gold room was sealed off again, but charm and a borrowed key from a cooperative janitor got me through the door. The place still glittered like a set piece for Midas's funeral. I prowled the perimeter, checking for anything the police had missed, which, given Kramer's efficiency, meant plenty. Behind a brocade panel near the west wall, I found what looked like an air vent. Only, it wasn't for air. The grill was fake, and a narrow duct ran down at an angle that smelled faintly of damp concrete and dust. I dropped my flashlight beam inside. The shaft descended toward the basement vault, big enough for a man, or a few neatly packed gold ingots, to slide through. Well, I muttered, somebody's been improving on club service routes. The janitor who'd loaned me the key poked his head in. You find something? Yeah, I said, a new shortcut between greed and opportunity. If Wolfe was right, and he usually was, then the gold hadn't been stolen so much as relocated. And if the ventilation shaft was part of the act, someone had known the building's insides better than its members did. That meant an inside man. And those tend to disappear fast once the lights go on. Back at the brownstone, Fritz was in the kitchen, performing what he called culinary meditation. The aroma of veal stock was competing with the sharper scent of lemon polish. Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids, and I took the chance to raid the fridge before Fritz noticed. He noticed. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, hands on hips, "I can tell when someone has touched the sauce. It is delicate. You disturb it. It protests." I grinned. "Then tell your sauce to file a complaint." He sniffed theatrically. "You smell that? Lunch?" "No," he said, tapping his nose. "Gold. When it is polished, it leaves a scent, like warm rain on brass. Subtle, but it clings. I noticed it once in Vienna, in a jeweler's shop. That got my attention. I hustled upstairs and found Wolfe dictating something to himself. "Fritz's nose just paid for itself," I told him. "He says polished gold smells like rain on brass." Wolfe looked up, pleased. "Excellent. So the air in the gold room carried that same trace." "Maybe," I said. "It's subtle." He leaned back. "Not subtle. Telltale. The scent of deliberate handling. Someone preparing gold, not admiring it. That, Archie, narrows the list from thieves to craftsmen." I couldn't resist. "Or killers with expensive hobbies." "Both," he said simply. Saul Panzer showed up that evening with the expression of a man who'd been digging through mud, metaphorically and otherwise. He didn't waste words. "We've got a missing person. Name's Miguel Ramos, club janitor. Worked near the gold room every night, cleaning vents, mopping floors. Nobody's seen him since Tuesday." Wolfe's brows climbed. "The night of the first murder." "Right," Saul said. "Ramos lived in a tenement 2 blocks from the club. Rent unpaid, bed unslept in, paycheck waiting at the desk." I leaned against the globe stand. "You think he saw something?" Saul nodded. "Too much. Maybe who carried that gold. Maybe who killed Maren. Either way, he's not sightseeing." Wolfe drummed his fingers. "A janitor who disappears after 2 murders and a theft is not missing. He has been erased. The question is, where?" Saul met my eyes. "Basement, maybe. That building's got a furnace big enough to heat the Hudson." That image wasn't pleasant. Wolfe closed his eyes. "Archie, take Mr. Panzer's lead. If Mr. Ramos remains in that furnace, I wish you to find proof. Not remains, proof." I grabbed my coat. "Sure. But if I find both, I'll send the proof special delivery and keep the rest out of sight." The Cornell Club's basement smelled like old coal and bad conscience. The furnace was still roaring when Saul and I got there, its heat licking the air like a live thing. The engineer, a big man with the nerves of a house cat, pretended not to notice us. "We're looking for Ramos," I said. "You seen him?" He hesitated. "Not since Tuesday. He was supposed to clean the vent chute. Never showed." Saul's flashlight swept the furnace area. The floor was gritty with ash and fine black dust, but near the chute's opening, a glint caught the beam. Something metallic, embedded in the residue. I crouched, scraped it loose. It wasn't coal. It was a lump of fused gold, small as a coin. I didn't need Wolfe to tell me what that meant. We pried open the maintenance hatch, and the stench hit. Burnt fabric, oil, and something worse. Ramos had been cleaned up, all right. I backed away, throat tight. "Well," I said hoarsely, "that's one way to erase payroll." Saul nodded grimly. "And to melt the evidence while you're at it." I went to the phone booth upstairs and dialed the brownstone. When Wolfe answered, my voice came out tighter than I liked. "We've got our 3rd corpse," I said, "and this one glows in the dark." "Then, Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe replied, calm as ever, "it is time to dim the lights and let truth shine. When Nero Wolfe stays up past midnight, you know civilization has lost its footing. Normally, the man treats 12 o'clock as an uncrossable frontier, beyond which only lunatics, musicians, and policemen operate. But that night, he was at his desk, cigar blazing like a small furnace, dictating numbers to me as though they were poetry. Item, he said, a balance discrepancy of $42,000, concealed beneath a series of identical ledger entries, each labelled restoration materials. I yawned. You call this bedtime reading? He ignored me. Item, a shipment of bullion reported missing 3 weeks ago, reappearing as private collection assets. That's quite a trick, I said. Make gold vanish, call it art. Silence, Archie, the figures converse. I am merely translating. He puffed twice and leaned back. What do these numbers suggest to you? That you need a new hobby. He grunted. They suggest structure, and structure implies an architect. Meaning Ketteridge? Meaning, he said dryly, that our dear Simon has been building castles of fraud, each brick plated in gold leaf. He dictated another line, while I fought the urge to sleep. For Wolfe, numbers were music. For me, they were a lullaby in an unfamiliar language. But somewhere between the cigar smoke and the arithmetic, I could feel him tightening the noose around someone's neck. By the time the clock struck 1, Wolfe had settled into the tone of a man dismantling a cathedral just to prove a point. He rose, a rare event, and paced with deliberate weight, his robe trailing like judicial robes. Archie, he began, I am now persuaded that the gold was never stolen. I blinked. Come again? It was made to disappear, he said, tapping his temple. Not removed, but transmuted, figuratively. Its disappearance conceals a fraud of admirable symmetry. The theft is the camouflage. Meaning someone cooked the books? Precisely. A theft reported to cover a theft already consummated. When the vaults were inspected, they found absence where gold once was, but that absence existed months earlier. Then the murders. Collateral, the first to silence, the second to distract. He lowered himself into the chair again. The elegance of the plan almost compels admiration. Gold, unlike cash, is tangible. To steal it unnoticed, one must make the world believe it still exists. I scribbled his words down, though half of them sounded like riddles. So our murderer's a magician. Wolfe's lips twitched. No, Archie. A mathematician of greed. One who trades in illusions gilded with precision. But even illusion leaves fingerprints. He looked at me. And you, my good fellow, are about to fetch one. Next morning, I found myself at the Cornell Club's accounting office, a room that smelled of old ink and older secrets. The club's secretary, a nervous man with the charm of an adding machine, let me poke through ledgers as long as I didn't disturb the order. I assured him my middle name was Order, which was only a small lie. After 2 hours of cross-eyed reading, I hit pay dirt. The ledgers for the private art fund showed curious transactions. Large deposits labelled as bullion investments, followed by withdrawals matching the value of forged paintings sold through back channels. Every trail led to Simon Ketteridge's approval stamp. The man had turned paper into gold and back again, an alchemist without a conscience. I jotted a note for Wolfe. Ketteridge's hobby, turning fiction into fortune. Before I left, I asked the secretary one casual question. Who audits these accounts? He hesitated. No one recently. Mr. Ketteridge oversaw them personally. He's meticulous. I thanked him and walked out, chewing over that word. Meticulous men don't leave bodies lying around unless they're desperate or scared. Wolfe had called it right. Ketteridge wasn't stealing gold. He was manufacturing invisibility, and the cost of production was murder. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was knee-deep in thought, which for him meant total stillness. I spread the photocopies across his desk like a gambler showing his hand. Observe, I said. Simon's fingerprints all over the financial sheets. And here's the kicker. Eleanor Vale's late husband's name appears on several forged certificates. His eyelids twitched open. Indeed, Signed, dated, and notarized, after his death. Wolfe exhaled through his nose. Ah, posthumous complicity. Ingenious. It transforms suspicion into sentiment. Who would accuse a dead man of crime? Simon Ketteridge, apparently. Wolfe's voice sharpened. Not merely accuse, use. By attaching the husband's signature to the counterfeit certificates, he weaponized the widow's grief. When discovery comes, she stands as inheritor of guilt, not victim of deceit. I sat down. So, she's been wearing a bullseye since the beginning. Precisely. He flicked ash into the tray. Her husband's ghost serves as the perfect patsy, his widow as the perfect distraction. Neat, I said, and homicidal. Two virtues our culprit prizes highly. Wolfe leaned forward. You will now proceed to verify those signatures. If they are forgeries, we have proof of his craft. If genuine, we have proof of collusion. Either way, I said, reaching for my hat, we've got him cornered. He gave a small, satisfied nod. Yes, Archie. The alchemist's gold is beginning to tarnish. As I headed out the door, the phone rang. Saul's voice crackled through. Archie, you better tell Wolfe. There's a receipt you'll want to see. It's for gold refining, and the name signed on it isn't Ketteridge. I froze. Then who? Harvey Dane, Saul said, the secretary. And just like that, the plot thickened faster than Fritz's custard. Wolfe was still steaming, mentally, not physically, over Ketteridge's elaborate trickery. His temper was a rare thing, slow to boil, but volcanic when it arrived. The room felt like it had too much air and not enough peace. That was when Fritz appeared in the doorway, clutching a watering can and looking tragic. Mr. Wolfe, he said, in the tone usually reserved for funerals. The orchids, they are unhappy. The humidity is wrong, and they droop. It is heartbreaking. Wolfe scowled. Damnation, Fritz. I have men lying, women dying, and fortunes evaporating, and you bring me botany. Fritz drew himself up, unoffended. The orchids are alive, monsieur. They suffer when ignored, just as men do when they deceive. He turned and left with wounded dignity. Wolfe sat in silence for a long moment, then sighed. An event that, in our house, counts as repentance. Archie, he murmured, Fritz is insufferably correct. Orchids never lie. They wilt. They signal distress. Humans, however, flourish on deceit until they rot. I couldn't help grinning. So we're comparing suspects to plants now? Yes, he said, steepling his fingers, and I intend to prune one very soon. That sounded like trouble, and coming from Wolfe, trouble always bloomed fast. It was after midnight again when I decided to focus on Harvey Dane, the secretary who managed to look both invisible and indispensable at the same time. Every operation had one, the man who knew where the papers were buried. The Cornell Club's records showed Dane handled administrative logistics, which translated roughly to whatever made Ketteridge's life easier. He answered calls, signed shipments, even supervised repairs in the gold room. In a racket this neat, he was either a genius or an accomplice. I dialed a few numbers, starting with the club's night operator. You ever see Dane late at the office? I asked. Most nights, she said. He stayed after everyone else. Claimed it was inventory work. Inventory, sure. Probably counting how much fraud he could file before dawn. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe had retired, leaving me to my phone routine. I called a warehouse, a delivery service, and one discreet contact in Treasury. All had one name attached to recent private shipments, Harvey Dane. When I finally hung up, I poured myself a beer. Dane wasn't just a secretary, he was the club's ghost. Quiet, tireless, and always moving behind someone else's shadow. And in my experience, ghosts with ledgers rarely haunt by accident. The next morning, I paid a visit to the Cornell Club's records department again, armed with Wolfe's authorization letter, a polite smile, and a forged patience. The clerk, more interested in his cigarette than the ledgers, waved me toward a stack of invoices. Hours later, I found it. A single receipt buried among dull paperwork. Order 4783. Refining and recasting, private commission. The name at the bottom stopped me cold. Not Simon Kettridge, Harvey Dane. The date matched the week before Marin's murder. The order was for remelting damaged bullion into new ingots, standard enough on paper, except the destination was blank. No delivery address, no signature of receipt. I sat back, whistling low. The quiet secretary had been moving gold, not stealing it. Refining, disguising, laundering it under everyone's noses. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket. It was the first solid proof that Dane was more than Simon's errand boy. He was the chemist behind the alchemy. As I left, the corridor seemed too quiet. Footsteps echoed behind me, soft but certain. I turned. Nothing. Maybe it was just nerves. Or maybe the man I'd just exposed already knew I had. By the time I reached the street, I was sure of one thing. The gold wasn't the only thing being melted down. Someone had started refining people too, and I might be next in line. When Nero Wolfe dictates letters, it's usually to editors who've misused adverbs or to lawyers who've overcharged him. But that morning, the letters he handed me were different. Each one was bait, polished and polite, and aimed squarely at the throats of 4 people who had one thing in common. They all had something to lose. "Deliver them personally," Wolfe said, sealing the last envelope with his thumb. "It lends weight." "They'll think it's a summons," I told him. "Good. Fear sharpens perception. I require perceptive guests." The list was a rogues gallery. Simon Kettridge, the club president with too much charm. Harvey Dane, the secretary whose quietness could drown a confession. Eleanor Vale, the widow tangled in everyone else's sins. And finally, Inspector Kramer, an invitation Wolfe described as a courtesy, not a necessity. Each note read the same. "Mr. Wolfe requests your presence at his brownstone tomorrow noon to clarify certain misunderstandings regarding the late Mr. Marin and the matter of the missing gold." When I dropped the last envelope in Dane's hand, I caught a flicker behind his eyes, like a candle about to meet a draught. By the time I got back, Wolfe was at his desk, already dictating the seating order. "You've baited the trap, Archie," he said. "Now let us see which rat values his composure least." Wolfe hadn't said what the plan was, but I could feel it hanging in the air, the same thick anticipation you get before a thunderstorm or a bad verdict. When Wolfe starts rearranging the dining room, it isn't for decor, it's for drama. I found him among the orchids, scowling at a vanda that hadn't bloomed. "You're up to one of your drawing room detonations," I said. He didn't turn. "I beg your pardon?" "You're calling the suspects together, making me your usher, and polishing your logic until it shines. I've seen this movie before." He glanced at me. "A metaphorical comparison to cinema is beneath you. Restrain it." "All right then. What's the fuse this time?" "Observation, Mr. Goodwin. Yours. You will use both eyes and engage neither tongue. There is art in silence." "Sure," I said. "And there's danger in it too." "Not for you," he replied, which was supposed to be reassuring. It wasn't. By the time I left him to his orchids, I was certain he already knew who'd done it. The trick with Wolfe was never figuring out when he solved the case. It was realizing he'd probably known the answer hours before the first clue turned up. Still, whatever was coming tomorrow wasn't going to be a luncheon. It was going to be an execution, with silverware. If the devil ever hosts a banquet, I hope Fritz Brenner gets the catering contract. By noon, the kitchen smelled like paradise on probation. Duck à l'orange, truffle risotto, and the kind of coffee that could bribe angels. Fritz moved through the kitchen like a priest at the altar, calm, humming under his breath. "Mr. Wolfe says the meal must soothe the nerves," he told me. "Perhaps it will soften the tempers. Or sharpen them," I said. He winked. "That too." At the table, Wolfe sat like a general before battle, immovable, impeccable, and apparently unconcerned. He was reading a book on medieval metallurgy, which, under the circumstances, felt almost insulting to the living. The phone rang twice before Saul Panzer called in with some final detail, and Wolfe nodded to himself. "The storm," he murmured, "is punctual." I looked around the room, the polished glassware, the orchid centerpiece, the subtle scent of citrus and tobacco. It was too perfect. The calm before orchestras start wars. Fritz emerged carrying the platter, steam rising like smoke from a battlefield. "Your guests will dine well," he said proudly. "Indeed," Wolfe replied. "They shall have no cause to accuse me of cruelty, at least not gastronomic." When the doorbell rang, I had a feeling lunch was about to lose its flavor. The guests hadn't yet arrived when Saul Panzer showed up, smelling faintly of rain and railroad dust. He looked like he'd been chasing truth through a tunnel. "Got it," he said, handing Wolfe a folder. Ledger entries, vault records, and a confession written in bureaucracy. Wolfe adjusted his glasses. "Speak." "Harvey Dane's been siphoning real gold from the Cornell vault for months," Saul said, "replacing it with gilded lead bars. Same weight, same shine. Nobody checked because they trusted the paperwork. Ketteridge signed everything Dane handed him." I let out a low whistle. "That's not theft. That's art." "Patient art," Saul said. "The kind that ends in bodies." Wolfe smiled, a small, tight expression reserved for moments of absolute certainty. "An exquisite pattern. Dane transforms gold into deception, Ketteridge into distraction, and Mrs. Vale into pity. Each role necessary, none innocent." He placed the folder on the table and looked at me. "Mr. Goodwin, ensure that all are seated before I speak. It is unsightly to arrest a man mid-duck." "Meaning Kramer's getting the real show." "Precisely. I require a witness of unimpeachable disbelief." I nodded, watching Wolfe light his cigar. There was no doubt now. The net was set, the lines drawn. All that remained was to see whether Harvey Dane would walk into the room or try to vanish like his gold. As I moved to answer the knock at the door, I caught a glimpse of Wolfe's face. Calm, unreadable, and faintly amused. It was the look he wore when he'd already won, and the rest of us were about to find out how. When Nero Wolfe decides to host a ceremony of logic, he makes sure the altar is well polished. That afternoon, his office looked like a courtroom dressed for a wedding. Brandy decanter glinting, chairs arranged with surgical precision, and Wolfe seated behind his desk like the high priest of reason. The bell rang 4 times in 10 minutes. First came Harvey Dane, as stiff as a pressed obituary, eyes darting like a man who'd misplaced a secret. Then Simon Ketteridge arrived, his charm wrapped in defensiveness. Eleanor Vale followed, pale and trembling, clutching her handbag as though it contained absolution. Inspector Kramer completed the ensemble, rumpled, red-faced, and ready to explode. "What's this, Wolfe?" he demanded. "You running a dinner theatre?" "Hardly," Wolfe said, his tone as smooth as the brandy he poured. "Sit, Inspector. I assure you, by dessert, you will have your murderer, or indigestion." They sat. The room thickened with unease. Wolfe, unbothered, swirled his drink. "I have invited you," he said, "not for confession, but for correction. Truth, alas, has been mistreated in this affair, and I intend to restore its dignity." Ketteridge scoffed. "You mean to accuse someone here?" "Not yet," Wolfe replied, eyes half-lidded. "The facts will speak presently. I merely propose to lend them a microphone." At 3 minutes past 2, I noticed Wolfe's eyes flick toward the clock. For him, that was panic. The courier carrying the Cornell Club's vault ledger was late, 20 minutes past schedule. For anyone else, that was city traffic. For Wolfe, it was an existential insult. Ketteridge shifted in his seat. "If you're waiting for evidence, perhaps your informant lost his way." "He is not lost," Wolfe said calmly, "merely delayed by circumstance or interference." Kramer grunted. You sound like you already know what's in that ledger. I know what should be in it, Wolfe said. What it reveals depends on how inventive Mr. Dane has been with his arithmetic. Dane bristled. If you're accusing me... I accuse no one, Wolfe interrupted. I observe. Though observation, in capable hands, is often fatal to illusion. The silence that followed could have been sliced and served cold. Eleanor Vale's fingers trembled against the brandy glass. Ketteridge avoided her eyes. The clock ticked louder than necessary. Wolfe leaned back, unruffled. Punctuality, he murmured, is a virtue murderers often misplace. They are rarely late for crime, but almost always late for consequence. He closed his eyes, as though bored with their breathing. I, meanwhile, stood by the window, nerves tuned to every passing sound. Something in the air was about to break. And when it did, it wouldn't be quiet. The break came not as thunder, but as a gunshot. One sharp crack split the afternoon. I was at the door before the echo faded. Wolfe's voice followed, sharp and deliberate. Be careful, Archie. I yanked the door open. On the brownstone steps, a deliveryman lay sprawled, his cap knocked aside, his satchel flung halfway down the stairs. The brass handle of the door gleamed wet with blood. A small revolver rested by his hand. Wrong angle, wrong story. The ledger, bound in blue leather, was still clutched against his chest. I crouched, checked his pulse, and muttered a curse. Too late. Then, because Wolfe trained me well, I used a handkerchief to lift the ledger free. The man's eyes were still open, staring at nothing. Kramer barreled out behind me, gun drawn. Goodwin! What the hell? Deliveries arrived, I said grimly. Signature not required. He knelt beside the body, swearing under his breath. I'll call homicide. Do, I said, already turning back toward the door. Upstairs, the silence of the office pressed down like a verdict waiting to be read. I climbed fast, ledger in hand, blood still slick on the binding. Wolfe hadn't moved. The others stared as I entered. The widow gasped. Ketteridge went white. Dane just froze. I held up the book. It's here, but the courier's dead. Wolfe's voice came slow and even. Bring the ledger, Mr. Goodwin, and mind you don't smudge the truth. As I crossed the carpet, I realized Wolfe's eyes weren't on the ledger at all. They were on Harvey Dane, who'd stopped breathing normally and was staring at the blood on my hands as though he recognized it. If you've never seen guilt wearing evening clothes, you should have been in Wolfe's office that night. They filed in like actors arriving late to a play they hadn't rehearsed for, each one pretending they didn't know the ending. Simon Ketteridge came first, the kind of man who still believed posture could hide panic. Behind him shuffled Harvey Dane, pale and tight-lipped, his eyes flicking toward the door like a cat testing escape routes. Eleanor Vale followed, elegant even in distress, clutching her gloves as if they might explain the last week of her life. And then came Kramer, his cigar clenched like a weapon. He looked at me and grunted. He's staging another of his tea parties, huh? More like a wake, I told him, with better hors d'oeuvres. Wolfe sat at his desk, monumental as always, expression unreadable. Fritz hovered discreetly, tray in hand, pouring brandy that nobody wanted but everybody accepted. The air was thick enough to slice prosciutto, and I had the feeling Wolfe would taste it just to confirm its quality. The chandelier above glowed with a soft golden light, which struck me as ironic considering we'd been chasing missing gold for a week. Wolfe finally spoke, his voice mild as butter. Ladies and gentlemen, we begin. And like that, the room stopped breathing. Kramer started boiling before Wolfe even turned up the heat. If this is another of your circus acts, he barked, you'll find your audience less patient this time. Wolfe puffed his cigar, unbothered. Patience is rarely your burden, Inspector. Sit. I'll stand, Kramer growled. You drag me from real work for parlor tricks. Real work? Wolfe lifted an eyebrow. You mean assembling contradictory statements and calling it progress? Kramer's colour deepened. I've got a dead delivery man and 2 corpses connected to that fancy club. If you've got something, talk. Otherwise, Wolfe interrupted. You'll bluster, interrupt, and possibly break a chair. I am aware of your habits. The inspector took a step forward, fists twitching. I cleared my throat, ready to intercept, but Wolfe simply raised a hand. The time of fools, Inspector, is never wasted, he said serenely. It fills libraries. Kramer froze mid-growl. What the hell's that supposed to mean? That you should let me speak, Wolfe said. You may even learn something. A rare indulgence, I admit. The veins on Kramer's forehead pulsed, but he dropped into the red chair anyway. I hid a grin. Wolfe had once again converted rage into obedience, all while barely moving his lips. Wolfe set down his cigar and looked around. Now, he said quietly, shall we begin the dissection? Wolfe's voice went soft, the kind of soft that cuts deeper than shouting. Let us begin with chronology, he said. The night Julian Marin died, each of you was either within the gold room or pretending not to be. He turned towards Simon first. You claimed you attended an art auction until 11, yet the auctioneer's record shows your bid slip left blank at 10:15. Explain the discrepancy. Simon's jaw twitched. I stepped out for air. Air, Wolfe repeated. That happened to be scented with gold dust, no doubt. Simon said nothing. Then Wolfe faced Eleanor Vale. You swore you went home directly after arguing with Marin, but the night clerk at your apartment saw you return after midnight, visibly shaken. You dropped a glove, later found near the club's side entrance. Her face paled. Yes, I went back. I thought I left something behind, that's all. Indeed, Wolfe said mildly. A life, perhaps. Next came Dane. And you, Mr. Dane, claim you were home reconciling ledgers. Yet those same ledgers contain additions made after the time you claim to have retired. Curious how dishonesty keeps late hours. The room shrank with every word. Even Kramer sat motionless, watching Wolfe peel their stories layer by layer until only nerves and truth remained. Wolfe let the silence stretch before dropping his next sentence like a guillotine. Mrs. Ketteridge's death, however, was not murder in the conventional sense. It was theatre. Simon stiffened. Dane's hand jerked toward his collar. Eleanor gasped. Wolfe continued, unhurried. Diana Ketteridge was already dead when that gun was placed in her hand. The note was written not by despair, but devotion. Devotion misplaced. Mr. Dane composed it. Kramer shot forward in his chair. You're saying Dane killed her? Not precisely, Wolfe replied. He concealed her death. He staged her suicide to protect his partner, Simon Ketteridge. Their partnership was not limited to fiscal enterprise. A hush fell. Eleanor's gloved hand covered her mouth. Simon's face flushed a violent red. That's a lie, Simon hissed. Truth rarely flatters, Wolfe said. You and Mr. Dane shared more than gold. You shared a scheme and an affection. When Julian Marin threatened exposure, Mr. Dane silenced him. When Mrs. Ketteridge learned of it, you silenced her heart. If not by violence, then by deceit. Dane rose halfway from his chair. You have no proof. I have arithmetic, Wolfe said. And arithmetic, Mr. Dane, never lies about love or theft. The words landed like hammer blows. Even Kramer didn't interrupt. Wolfe turned towards Simon, whose knuckles were white against the armrest. The partnership fractured, he said. Your loyalty lasted precisely until fear entered the room. Simon sneered. You think I'd trust anyone to steal for me? Not trust, Wolfe said smoothly. Use. When Ramos, the janitor, discovered the false bullion and the hidden vent shaft, you ordered his death. Mr. Dane obeyed, until he realized you meant to hang him with the evidence. That's insane, Simon snapped. Hardly, Wolfe countered. You replaced the missing gold with gilded lead, recast the real metal into new form, artistic light fixtures, as your invoices called them. Elegant, yes. Profitable, more so. Kramer let out a low whistle. You're saying the damn chandelier. Precisely, Wolfe said, without looking at him. The gold glowed above you all the while, mocking your ignorance. Simon rose abruptly. This is absurd. Wolfe's voice sharpened. Absurd, yet accurate. Mr. Dane, you were his accomplice and lover. He, your puppeteer. When you hesitated, he turned executioner. That courier who died on my steps carried the proof, meant to bury you. Dane's face drained of colour. He wouldn't. Oh, but he did, Wolfe said. The double cross of gold always ends the same way. One man buried beneath it, the other smothered by its shine. Wolfe leaned back, savouring the moment like a gourmand about to announce the final course. You may recall, he said, Fritz's observation about scent. Gold, when polished, leaves a faint metallic trace, akin to warm rain on brass. Fritz nodded proudly from the doorway. It lingers, yes, monsieur. Wolfe inclined his head. Indeed. That scent pervaded the gold room even after its cleaning. It was not dust. It was air infused from above. The ventilation shaft connected directly to the chandelier. He gestured upward. Those fixtures, Mr. Ketteridge, were cast weeks ago, before Marin's death. The missing gold was never missing. It hung over your heads, gleaming daily, mocked by your own craftsmanship. Kramer squinted. And you can prove that? Easily, Wolfe said. Mr. Goodwin, the small sample from Saul's coat pocket. I handed over the scrap of fused metal we'd found near Ramos's furnace. Wolfe set it beside a shaving Fritz had discreetly taken, from one chandelier arm. The match was perfect. The same alloy, Wolfe said. Our murdered janitor, the unfortunate courier, and this room's decoration, all bound by alchemy and arrogance. Kramer muttered, I'll be damned. Wolfe gave him a thin smile. An outcome devoutly to be avoided, Inspector. Across the desk, Simon's composure cracked, and Harvey Dane's eyes went wild. The scent of gold had turned into the stench of fear. It started with a sound halfway between a sigh and a curse. Simon slumped back in his chair, face grey, pride leaking out faster than truth. All right, he rasped. Yes, I knew. Dane handled the shipments. I signed the papers. But Ramos, he was supposed to disappear quietly. Wolfe's gaze was pitiless. Murder rarely makes a discreet exit. Dane stood suddenly. You used me, he spat. I did everything. You said it was for both of us. Sit down, Dane, Kramer barked, but Dane was already moving toward the door. I stepped forward. Don't bother. They're waiting outside. Right on cue, two of Kramer's men appeared in the doorway. Dane froze, trembling. He'll hang me. Wolfe exhaled. The law, Mr. Dane, has a preference for those who tell the truth first. Consider the sequence. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Dane broke, shoulders shaking, words spilling like coins. The confession filled the room, the forged ledgers, the melted gold, the night Diana died. Eleanor Vale sat motionless, her eyes fixed on nothing. When the men were led away, she rose unsteadily. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe, she whispered, for seeing what I couldn't. Wolfe bowed slightly. Madam, I merely observed what others preferred to ignore. As the door closed behind them, Kramer turned and growled. One day, Wolfe, your smugness will get you killed. Wolfe leaned back, eyes half shut. That, he murmured, would be extravagant waste, even for homicide. By the time the last flashbulb faded and the final fingerprint was dusted, the brownstone had settled back into its natural rhythm, the kind of silence that only follows thunder. Kramer's men had left in a blaze of self-importance, carting Harvey Dane and Simon Ketteridge downtown, and the door had barely closed before Wolfe reclaimed his throne. He was in his chair, of course, like some Roman emperor returning from war, only this one hadn't moved farther than the dining room. The office smelled of cigars, orchids and triumph, which, in Wolfe's case, were pretty much synonyms. I leaned against the globe stand. You could at least pretend exhaustion. The rest of us risked bullets. Exertion, Mr. Goodwin, he said without opening his eyes, is measured by intellect, not locomotion. I did the work. Sure, I said, and I'll send the invoice to the undertaker for the deliveryman. Wolfe grunted. That was as close as he ever got to gratitude. Fritz peeked in from the doorway. Shall I prepare supper, gentlemen? Wolfe lifted one finger. Yes, Fritz. Something restorative. The mind, when occupied with mediocrity all week, deserves indulgence. As he sank deeper into the chair, the smug serenity rolled off him like cigar smoke. The storm had passed. Wolfe, naturally, had been the calm at its centre. Dinner that night had the kind of quiet only victory earns. Fritz had outdone himself. Veal in Madeira sauce, buttered asparagus, and enough truffles to make a banker honest for 5 minutes. Wolfe, meanwhile, was in rare form, contemplative, expansive, and just this side of preachy. Gold, he said, slicing delicately into his veal, is not evil, Mr. Goodwin. It is merely efficient. It accelerates the corruption already present. I sipped my wine. So it's like whiskey for the soul. Crude but accurate, he said. Men are not undone by possession, but by illusion. They imagine wealth will render them invulnerable. Instead, it magnifies their weaknesses. Fritz, hovering near the sideboard, nodded solemnly as if Wolfe were quoting scripture. Ja, gold blinds the heart, he murmured. Wolfe gestured with his fork. Precisely. Greed is the worship of illusion. These men forged not currency, but belief, and belief is the most dangerous counterfeit of all. I said, that'll play well on a bronze plaque, right next to your waistline measurements. He ignored me, as usual, turning back to Fritz. You may tell Inspector Kramer, should he ever deign to visit for an apology, that truth, like a fine ragout, requires patience and proper seasoning. I grinned. I'll tell him, but don't expect him to digest it. The morning papers did their usual trick, turned reality into entertainment. Police crack, gilded murder ring, one headline screamed, beneath a photo of Kramer looking like he'd just invented justice. Wolfe's contribution, naturally, went unmentioned. According to the Gazette, the inspector had single-handedly uncovered a complex scheme of fraudulent metallurgy. Wolfe snorted so hard I thought his chair might tilt. I should invoice him, he muttered. For what? I asked. The privilege of ignorance, he said. He has converted my labour into his laurels. I am forced to admire the efficiency. I skimmed the column aloud. Inspector Kramer's decisive intuition led to multiple arrests. That sound about right to you? Decisive intuition, Wolfe repeated, a phrase that could only be uttered by a journalist unfamiliar with both decision and intuition. Fritz appeared with the coffee tray, looking scandalized. Such injustice, Herr Wolfe. Always they forget the one who truly solves the puzzle. Not always, I said. Wolfe's fans remember, and me, of course. You, Wolfe said dryly, are remembered chiefly by the dry cleaner. I raised my cup. Still, if Kramer's sleeping easy, maybe it means peace for a few days. Wolfe closed his eyes. Peace, Mr. Goodwin, is the intermission between the follies of men. Yeah, I said, and you sell tickets to both acts. Later, when the plates had been cleared and the coffee poured, Wolfe turned philosophical again, his preferred form of dessert. The cigar smoke curled like punctuation around his words. Gold, he said, is immutable and heavy. It resists fire, corrosion, and conscience alike. A perfect metaphor for folly. I stretched out in my chair. You've been talking about that metal all day. You planning to invest? Invest? He looked offended. In something that renders men fools. I already invest in humanity which provides similar dividends. Fritz refilled his glass of brandy as though performing communion. Wolfe raised it slightly. Consider, Mr. Goodwin, how swiftly intelligence succumbs to temptation. A man of means conspires with his subordinate. Affection becomes leverage. Greed becomes currency. It is a perfect alchemy, turning character to dust. Beautiful speech, I said. If you ever run for office, I'll print the pamphlets myself. I detest politics, he said. It is merely avarice in ceremonial attire. I grinned. Then you're in the right business. You get paid to expose it instead of practice it. His eyes narrowed. Mr. Goodwin, I tolerate you because you amuse me. Do not mistake it for approval. Never do, I said cheerfully. He sighed, almost content. Pfui. Man is changeable, gold is not. Therefore gold will always win. Just as Wolfe was winding down his sermon, Fritz glided in, bearing a tray fit for royalty, a golden creme caramel gleaming like treasure under the chandelier. I call it, Fritz announced proudly, the only gold worth coveting. That earned him a full inch of raised eyebrow from Wolfe, which for him was high praise. Fritz, he said solemnly, you have restored the concept of purity to both art and appetite. Fritz beamed. I took a spoonful and let out a low whistle. If greed always tasted like this, I'd sell my conscience wholesale. Your conscience, Wolfe murmured, is already at a discount. Sure, I said, but it's still open for negotiation. Wolfe ignored that and focused on the dessert like a jeweler appraising a flawless gem. For once, his expression softened, not with sentiment, but with satisfaction. The kind that comes when everything, for a brief moment, aligns perfectly. Justice served, order restored, and sugar just right. Fritz hovered like a saint awaiting benediction. Fritz, Wolfe said, setting down his spoon, you have transcended alchemy. You have turned vice into virtue. Fritz bowed slightly. Danke, Herr Wolfe. I leaned back, smiling. Looks like we finally found your weakness, boss. He gave a small grunt that might have been laughter, or indigestion. An hour later, the house was quiet again. Fritz had retired to his kitchen kingdom, and I found Wolfe in the plant rooms, where the orchids breathed their slow perfume under the lamps. He sat there, eyes half closed, surrounded by colours no jeweller could replicate. Contentment, he said softly, is the rarest currency of all. Yeah, I said, and you just spent some. He didn't answer, just reached out to adjust a blossom as tenderly as if it could testify in court. The orchids, at least, never lied to him. I leaned on the doorframe. So that's the end of the gold business. No more greed, no more gunfire, no more invoices. Pfui, he murmured, until the next fool convinces himself that wealth is wisdom. The glow from the lamps hit his face, and for the first time all week, I saw a trace of real peace. Not triumph, peace. If you ever see Nero Wolfe smiling at dessert, I said, take it as proof that the world, for one small evening, made sense. He sighed and reclined, eyes half shut. Mr. Goodwin, he said, you are sentimental beyond reason. Maybe, I said, but I'm right. Pfui, he muttered. Bring me the orchids. Justice, when it finally came, felt less like thunder and more like the quiet settling of dust after a storm. The gold was found, the lies laid bare, but some things, like pride and longing, can't be melted down or weighed. Wolfe returned to his orchids, content in logic's victory, while the rest of us were left to wonder what price truth really demands. What would you have done in Wolfe's place? Follow the heart's mercy or the mind's precision? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.